Senator Ludlam. Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. A number of Australians recently travelled to Malaysia to work with the growing mass movement in that country, protesting against the construction of an Australian toxic rare earth refinery plant located near a city of 600,000 people. The processing plant being built by the Australian mining company Lynas Corporation has met with strong resistance from locals, with protests as big as 15,000. The Australians have joined protests organised by the Malaysian movement Himpunan Hijau, meaning Green Assembly, which is protesting to shut Lynas. On behalf of the Australian Greens, I congratulate all those involved. A Sydney-based international mining campaigner, Nat Lowry, is one of 16 people who has been jailed in recent days because of protests they have been involved in. Ms Lowry spoke to me before she left, and she explained why she was going because of her deep concern about Lynas's activity and how they have no social licence to undertake these operations. Ms Lowry was motivated to go because of the danger this plant poses to the locals. In Australia, no company will get approval for this type of project, let alone a refinery of this scale, which risks both human health and the environment. Lynas's environmental impact assessment is deeply flawed. The company has not produced a safe permanent waste plan for its toxic and radioactive waste. The Greens believe that the Australian government, as a signatory of the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and their Disposal, should never have allowed an Australian corporation to export such a toxic legacy to Malaysia. I remain concerned that the people who have been jailed in this protest are still in jail from the last report I've received, and the Malaysian government would be wise to respect the right of people to protest and to immediately release Ms Lowry and all those detained. With regard to the mining operations and the processing plant, the ore to be processed in this controversial refinery will be actually mined in Western Australia and shipped out through the port of Fremantle to Malaysia. And Australia, interestingly, has refused to take back the toxic and radioactive waste produced in the refinery. Every year, at least 106 tonnes of radioactive thorium and a small quantity of uranium will be dumped amongst the waste, along with an unknown cocktail of other hazardous substances. And this is what is driving what are becoming international protests. According to a statement by the Save Malaysia Stop Lynas Coalition, the Lynas rare earth refinery plant was constructed without any prior informed consent from local communities, who will be getting the blunt end of the raw deal of permanent pollution risk, whilst Lynas would be obviously working hard to make a hefty profit, and a tax-free profit, we hear. Malaysians will be living under the shadow of radioactive contamination, and this simply is not acceptable, certainly not acceptable for this material to be sent from Australia and the waste to be dumped in another country. To make matters worse, the refinery is situated in a peat swamp area only 3.5 kilometres from the South China Sea, which is an important source of seafood and a tourism area. There are approximately 700,000 people living within 30 kilometres from the Lynas refinery, another fact that underlines how irresponsible this decision to locate this plant is. Malaysian environmental activists believe that Lynas is building the processing plant in Malaysia instead of Australia to cut costs and avoid having to deal with stringent environmental regulations in Australia for containing the waste. If the waste is safe, as the company claims, many of the locals argue that it should get sent back to Australia where the mining for the rare earth ore occurs. However, when this option was raised in the Western Australian Parliament on the 5th of April 2011 by Western Australian Greens MLC Robin Chappell, the Western Australian Minister for Mines and Petroleum, Norman Moore, firmly rejected the idea. I do congratulate my Greens colleagues in Western Australian Parliament, Robin Chappell and Lynn McLaren, for their work with the Malaysian community on this, and also Senator Scott Ludlam, who has also given a great deal of support. When Lynas was granted its licence, Robin Chappell said, this approval looks like the sanctioning of an Australian mining company making use of lax environmental controls and governance arrangements in a developing country. To my mind, it has not gone through a rigorous environmental process and should not have been issued. And this is certainly something that has been highlighted by many of the people who have looked at these plans in detail. And we know that Malaysia has already had a bit of experience with rare earth refineries. One was built at Bukit Merah in the state of Perak by the Japanese corporate company Mitsubishi. Now, that plant was actually forced to close down after drawn-out political and legal battles that lasted over a decade. Now, in that case, unfortunately, some locals suffered serious health effects before the plant did eventually close after many protests. Hopefully, the people around the Lynas plant don't actually have to go through the same experience. Because the Lynas plant is at least 10 times bigger, with hundreds of times potentially more toxic waste to be handled. Again, a reminder why this operation should not go ahead. I congratulate the large environmental group, Himpunan Huya. It's one of the largest environmental movements in Malaysia. Apart from feeling very strongly about the issue, I do feel very connected. When I became a senator, the very first group that I met with were representatives of this organisation on the first day when I became a senator. On many occasions, their members have travelled to Australia to protest at annual general meetings of Lynas, to address meetings, to organise events in this country to inform Australians about how wrong the plans of Lynas are. And certainly it is an issue that the Greens will continue to give our support to. And again, I congratulate Natalie Lowry, the young woman who has been jailed because of her participating in the protest, and the other Australians who have joined her, and tens of thousands of Malaysians in protesting against the plans of Lynas. I'd like to move on to another issue. I would like to take this opportunity in the Australian Senate to pay tribute to Neville Chappy Williams, an Aboriginal elder from Western New South Wales. He has made an enormous contribution to Australia. Firstly, as a former bantamweight boxer, Chappy knows a thing or two about a tough fight. After knocking out the official Australian bantamweight contender, Billy Booth, at the Golden Gloves in New South Wales, he nearly made it to the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. In the end, he was not able to travel to Japan because he was too poor to go and he didn't have the support. Chappy is an elder of the Wiradjuri people and a traditional owner of Lake Cowal and its surrounding land. And this is where he's been involved in another tenacious battle against the Canadian mining conglomerate Barrick Gold. And this is a campaign that's gone on over a decade, and it's in this capacity that I've met Chappy on a number of occasions. It was in 2001 when I first met him as a Greens New South Wales MP. I remember him talking about mining being the death of our dreaming, the death of our law, as he showed me around Lake Cowal during one of my visits to the region to discuss the impacts of mining with Chappy and his other representatives of his community. Chappy's experience with mining operations in his country was not the first time he had seen outsiders impose their values on his community. He spoke very movingly about his early memories of hiding in the long grass when welfare officers came to Lake Cowal. As in other parts of Australia, children were forcibly moved from their families in this area. Chappy felt the pain of the stolen generations, and he said he relayed the stories. You could feel that pain. Lake Cowal is the largest inland lake in New South Wales and an important wetland for birds who come from all over the world to breed. It's very valued by the locals. It's It's also a site of special religious significance for the Wiradjuri people and part of their ancient homeland. So you might think that its combined ecological and cultural value would safeguard it from environmental and social dislocation associated with the open-cast mining that Barrick Gold wanted to bring to this area. But you'd be wrong. And this is what Chappy has devoted so much of his life to stopping and now dealing with, because he's worked so hard to protect this area. And for much of the time he's been up against Barrick Gold, a company that describes itself as a disciplined mining multinational. That's its own language, disciplined, a disciplined company. This company appears, however, to run rings around state and federal regulators. Maybe that's what they mean by being disciplined. Now, Australia is a signatory to the Ramsar Convention, a global agreement to protect wetlands, and Chappy and his colleagues have worked to have the Ramsar respected at Lake Cowal, something which Barrick Gold has failed to do, along with the New South Wales government. But the 277 species of birds that would be at risk from any cyanide spill at the Barrick Gold mine at Lake Cowal count for little against the profits to be made by a Canadian mining baron. And that's just not my words, but when we hear what happened when Chappy met the CEO of Barrick Gold, it's understandable why those comments are made. The company itself is happy to advertise its environmental and social credentials. It states, "Our success depends on our ability to develop our resources responsibly and share the benefits of our business with local communities, governments and other stakeholders." Certainly Chappy said to me many times that they didn't see any of this sharing. But when pressed on their practical application, this company is evasive, and that's what Chappy has found so frustrating. With members of his community and supporters, Chappy has taken on this mining company, and this is an inspiring story that takes us from Western New South Wales to Canada and beyond. In 2007, Chappy Williams travelled to Canada for the company's annual general meeting. His intention was to confront Barrick Gold owners and the CEO, Peter Monk. Viewing the YouTubes of this work, it is an instructive illustration of what local communities are up against. You couldn't see two worlds further apart than when you watch what goes on at one of these AGM compared to a visit to the Aboriginal communities around Lake Cowal. Chappy, a quietly spoken man, puts his case across simply and succinctly. The response comes straight from the corporate playbook. First, the pleading of ignorance. "I'm only the CEO, I can't possibly know what my company actually does," is a summary of the defence. Peter Monk's actual words are, "I don't have the knowledge to debate." Then "We're a business, what did you expect?" That's coupled with the "don't blame us, we only get away with whatever the government allows us to do." As the Barrick Gold public relations man said, "We are in for profit, as you know. We are a free enterprise, so please, it's the state authorities that are there to protect you." In that sentence, the corporate responsibility line is exposed for the spin that it is, passing the buck, pushing it back onto the state government, a government that we know is so weak when it comes to dealing with mining companies and enforcing decent standards. Undeterred, a year after that meeting with the CEO, Chappy took his people's fight, to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This was in 2008. The Permanent Forum is an interesting body. It was established by the United Nations in response to demands from Indigenous peoples around the world for a high-level permanent body at the UN. The Forum provides an opportunity for the world's Indigenous peoples to speak out against the multiple injustices they face and to seek restitution. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was 25 years in the making, bringing Indigenous peoples' organisations and governments together to draw up concrete rights that could be enforced. When it was put to the UN General Assembly in 2007, 144 countries voted in favour, with only 4 voting against. Shamefully, Australia was one of those 4. Since, a statement has been issued by the Australian government on these issues, and it does go some way to rectifying that quite shameful position when we stood against those 144 countries. I remember when I was at Lake Cowal, Chappy talking to me about how important he saw this development of the United Nations, and he was inspired to take the battle of his people at Lake Cowal to this international forum. And he said in 2008, there is a world of difference between the free, prior and informed consultation with communities affected by mining advocated by the World Bank and the free, prior and informed consent in the declaration. Communities are poorly protected by Australian law. Chappy also said, as Aboriginal people, we have absolutely no power within the colonial legal system to protect Mother Earth. We have no right of veto. There is no recognised Aboriginal sovereignty over natural resources. Under the Native Title Act, traditional owners can only agree to benefit from the desecration and destruction of our mother. This is an abuse of our human rights and many of the rights in the Declaration. That was the theme of many of the speeches that Chappy has given, from Lake Cowal to Sydney, to Canada and to New York. Chappy Williams has really been in a David versus Goliath campaign, and this has continued despite Barrick Gold being granted permission to extend the lifetime of the mine to 2024. Chappy describes it as his sacred duty to protect Lake Cowal and our ancient cultural heritage. He says, "We will never give up. I will fight to the bitter end." I've got to say, having been to Lake Cowal, met with Chappy many times, heard the stories, heard him speaking to large and small events, it is moving, but it's also very sad, because Barrick Gold at the moment does have the upper hand. Chappy gives beautiful poetic speeches. They're very moving, but it is very disturbing when you hear him speak about the destruction of Aboriginal artefacts, about the challenges that he sees when it comes to freedom of his religion, and how he feels that their cultural connection with his country is being denied. I do thank Chappy for his enormous work for all of us, for his own communities, sharing those experiences, for the natural environment around Lake Cowal, and the lessons that we can learn from how he undertakes his work in a very peaceful, respectful way, but also very strong. Thank you, Acting Deputy President.